Thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm happy to join you. It's really nice to be here. Thanks.
What are some of your favorite things about being a researcher?
Oh, I love being a researcher. Number one is that you get to be very curious and skeptical um, about so many different kinds of things. If you're lucky enough to be a researcher at a college or university, you have so much freedom to decide what are the things that really interest me and that I have some idea, some prior that, might make some sort of difference to human behavior, to human well-being, to human society. So you get to first decide on topics like that in a way that I think is just really incredible. But the second thing that I really love about research is that it's so creative. So you have a bunch of guidelines, a bunch of rules to try to make it credible. So you want your research methodology to be rigorous and transparent, and you want enough participants in your sample to be able to make good claims. You have all these types of guidelines, but from there on out, it's really up to you to create a kind of scenario, a context in which you're testing human behavior against some sort of intervention, treatment, and making that as real to life as possible. And that's a really creative act. It's kind of like being a stage manager or working in theater somehow. You're trying to simulate life as it happens to try to understand life better. Good research and a fulfilling career is really all about the community that you build. And I've been so lucky, but I've also been very intentional about building community wherever I've gone in my career, whether it was in graduate school or my postdoctoral years, or now as an assistant professor, as an associate professor, as a full professor. Throughout my time, I've had different access to different people, and now as a professor, I have more of an ability to build a really formal community in terms of my lab group. But all along the way, whether it was through informal dinners that we set up for, people who were interested in similar things in my postdoctoral time, or, we would all meet, those of us interested in African politics and conflict. There was a group of us who met in graduate school at a particular restaurant. Building those kinds of communities are what gets you through. They're exciting, they're supportive. They give you ideas, they give you hope. They give you a lot of laughter. They can be challenging to navigate at times, just like any human relationship, but it teaches you a lot about academia, about life. And I think that it would be a much, much more isolating, lonely, stressful job without it. And so that's my advice for anyone getting into academia. And it's also my advice to anyone who's already there and is feeling alone or intimidated is to find your people and to nourish that, let them nourish you.
Now, your research is on a lot of challenging topics and oftentimes in challenging environments. So just to name a few, you've studied same-sex marriage in the United States, school conflict, mass violence in Rwanda. I'm curious about what inspires this work and what some of the challenges and some of the really, really great parts of it are.
All of these topics, I think that a common thread through all of them is that they seem like very important problems to try to solve. And I've been lucky enough to get started on the study of prejudice in graduate school, and that took me in many different places. That inspired me to better understand how prejudice was not involved in genocide and in recovery from genocide in a society, and then to identify common themes such as, well, then why do young people get into conflict and bully one another or harass one another? And how is that related to violence against women specifically, and women identified people and gender-based violence? So I think that one thing that happens as a researcher is you start out with one question, and usually the question is so broad because you don't really know how to narrow it down, and that's fine. But you find a particular case or cases where you study that question, and then that takes you down a path. And so for me in graduate school, I was really interested in, this big broad question of like, where has psychology gotten on this question of what can we do to reduce prejudice? And some of the answers were way more related than I thought they would be across those two settings. And that got me very interested in the topic of norms, our perceptions of what kinds of behaviors or attitudes are common and even desirable and rewarded in our communities. So that's I think the genesis of how I got interested in a lot of different things. And then, once you do one project in a particular setting, you start getting called on, to think about projects in similar settings. And so working in Rwanda got me interested in the Great Lakes of Africa more generally. So I've worked now in Congo and Burundi, the two neighboring countries. And then I branched out from there. So I think, that's another really exciting thing about being a researcher is that it takes you down this wandering path, and you have many forks. You can go different directions, but it often takes you to places you never thought you would end up. And most recently, I've done a project with two students who are now professors in Nigeria and West Africa, where I had never worked before. And so you end up in new places and working with a larger and larger cast of people, and on related but also different topics, which is really cool.
So part of what I hear you describing is this desire to be part of or to have a role in other communities, and I'm wondering how you go about doing that. So is there some kind of groundwork you need to lay before you enter a community to begin a research program?
Oh, very much so. So in my lab, for me and my students, we take this so seriously, not to ever use the sort of helicopter model of journalism where you just drop in for a crisis or some sort of reporting and then leave. That may have to be the case for some journalists at some times, but for us as researchers, we really need to immerse ourselves in the setting and as best we can try to understand how people in that setting are grappling with the topics that we're about to study. So not just how do we understand those topics in this setting, but how would a person who lives here all the time think about it? And of course, there's no one prototypical person. So how do you start to understand these things from multiple perspectives in this community? And I think that what's really been helpful for me in my career is that I don't just do international research. I also do research in the domestic sphere in the United States, as you pointed out. And what's really humbling about that is that it reminds you that even in your own country, you're not a native in the communities that you go into, right? So even when I was doing, for example, with my research team, a research program on conflict in schools in the state of New Jersey, which is where I now live, my adopted state, when I'm teaching at Princeton, I had to learn so much going in to each and every school. We were in 58 different schools. Even going into one school didn't necessarily tell you what the community was like in another school. And so I think everyone can appreciate the need to soak in and ask questions and be humble and observe when you go into international settings. But I can say the same thing for settings that are sometimes just down the road.
How does your personal background impact your perspective as a researcher?
I think that my own personal background, there are so many different ways. I mean, it's a nice question that you asked right after the question about, being respectful of contexts. I think we can learn a lot from anthropologists in how they are self-reflective about how being there in a research setting necessarily changes it. And how are people reacting to me? That's going to change, what I'm observing, right? So any anthropologist or ethnographer can tell you that. And so that's one thing that I'm always trying to be mindful of, and also mindful of how my maybe perceived commitments change the way people see me. So I, I identify as a woman, I identify as a feminist, I identify as queer. I think there are lots of different ways in which, that's guided my interest, certainly in inequality, in conflict, in prejudice, but also, it guides the way people, see my interests. And so it's something that I try to keep at the forefront when I'm doing research, not to try to bury it, but, to say, well, these are some of my assumptions going in about, how conflict works here, to teach me, what I'm not seeing. And I don't try to assume that, because I'm any of those things, that I have any privileged view on things. So I think it helps me maybe sometimes to relate to people, and to say, here's my assumption going into this. Tell me how I'm wrong, or what's sort of right about that? How would you add to that? Things like that, I think, are, reasons why I'm interested in particular things, and reasons why maybe I tend to read certain hypotheses into situations. But for me, that's always just a starting place. And I think that I was very influenced by some mentors early on who said, you wouldn't be able to predict what I'm studying right now based on who I am. And that's okay. You can follow the questions where they lead. They don't all need to be personally relevant, but you always need to remember that who you are as a person, it makes it relevant to you, and you need to interrogate that. And so that's not to say that it's not good to investigate questions that you personally feel passionate about or that are related to your identity. I think that's wonderful. But I think that always having, again, it's a little bit of that ethnographer's awareness of, how is my personal background affecting the way that I ask this question, or the way that the data are collected, or the way I read the data.
I also wanted to ask you, as you're describing your research, I'm hearing a strand of social justice and activism that's part of it. How do you manage all those different pieces? So the sort of purely theoretical and applied research, but then this activism, social justice piece as well.
A lot of my research is directly linked to movements for social justice, such as LGBT politics and activism for equality, and for recognition and for rights. Or you could think about peace movements as another social justice movement that my research very much relates to. I think that I think about my research, particularly when I'm studying interventions to reduce conflict or to promote recognition or rights. I think about that as very much a theoretical exercise. I run very large field experiments at times, with interventions that are actually intended to change behavior. But I've never run a nationwide policy or a nationwide social movement. And so for that reason, my experiments, I think of them very much as theoretical tests. They're not scaled up. They're not themselves social justice movements or interventions. And I stay very clear about that my work is not the work of social change. My work is about coming up with the scenarios under which we might expect social change, and trying to support movements in many ways, to try to suggest interventions, social processes that support and give rise to social justice. So I'm very careful. It's not just being humble, it's being very analytically clear about what is the role of experimentation and what is the role of social movements and policy change? They're two different things. And so my career as a social scientist, I think, is all about the situated evidence that could be used in those social movements or those policy changes. And perhaps at some point later in my career, I'll be ready to say, this is exactly the way a social movement should go, or this is exactly the public policy here. But I think actually that should be the work of activists and of our policy experts, and that my job is to advise, support, test, and that's how I see my role in those efforts.
On your lab website, I noticed that you recognize that the land you work and study on is the unceded traditional territory of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation. Can you tell me a little bit about that and why you wanted to include that information on your website?
Sure, thanks for noticing that. I think that this is something that it would really be wonderful if all individuals living in the United States could recognize, what land is that they are living and working on is originally the land of an indigenous group of people, because that is the truth of it, that we're all living on unceded land. And it's just one way that I want to build that into an everyday awareness. And so, some websites just, have the address of your lab so that people can come and visit. And we wanted that too, but I wanted to build that into this more quotidian, everyday recognition of that fact. It doesn't have to come in one big wallop of an emotional, movie that reminds you about the importance of Indigenous rights and recognition. Those are great too. Those are some of the things that I study actually, is, how mass media can remind us of these very important social dynamics and inequalities. But I'm also really interested in just the small quotidian ways we can do that, the everyday ways. And I think that actually, they come together though, because in general, I'm interested in pop culture. I'm interested in just the way we consume books and the internet, and how messages come across in those maybe less respected sometimes types of interventions for social justice, but actually they do catch the attention of people, hopefully, as they did in your case, who are perusing my website or just watching TV.
Knowing how busy life can become, especially when you are an academic where you have lots of overlapping responsibilities and a pretty flexible time frame in which to get those done, and a lot of independence, my question is, how do you begin to manage that? Is there a time at which you can turn it off and devote yourself to non-work related things, or is work just always sort of there for you?
That's a great question. And it's changed across my life course. I would say when I was a graduate student, it felt like work was ever present. That was my big challenge. And an undergrad too. It was my big challenge because I felt so much responsibility to get it done, or so much anxiety about whether it was going well. And it was at that stage of my career that I really developed coping mechanisms to deal with that. So I realized the importance of just constant maintenance of friendship, that you even when you're feeling anxious about something and kind of want to hide and work on that to relieve some anxiety, that you're always going to feel better, taking a time out to have dinner with a friend, and that it's a lot better for your friendship to do that too. And so recognizing the importance of that was something I learned in graduate school. And then also developing the ability to turn off your brain. And I think that really was something that I developed while I was traveling so much for my research. I think it's helpful to put yourself actually in a different physical location, and to focus on other things. And so while I was in my field site, of course I was thinking about my research, but I would often visit a new place while I was away internationally for research, or I would just take a car trip when I was back home in the States, in graduate school. And I really developed the ability to turn it off. And I would notice that I'd be ready to go back to work when my mind would start going back to that. But I'm talking about days at a time, like not, hours at a time, just really taking a break. And it was a nice sign that I was ready to do work again, that I was replenished when I would start thinking about work again, and getting excited about, or having an idea or something like that. These days, I am a single mother by choice of 2 small kids. And so I'm really busy with them. And sometimes that's nice because, they're the place I go to turn my mind off from research. But then sometimes I need my own space, and that's harder to find. And so it just changes all the time. I think I would say that your life changes all the time. And so you develop new and different coping skills for each life stage. And it's okay if an old coping skill doesn't work anymore. It's time for a new one, because you probably just have a different, you have a different circumstance you're facing.
Thank you, Dr. Levy Paluck. I greatly appreciate your time today and sharing your expertise and your experiences. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. This is such a great idea. And good luck with everything. It's really nice to talk to you.